If there was a pandemic, heaven forbid, ever to happen again, who do you think should have the final say in terms of how your life is impacted as a response? Well, the World Health Organization, they apparently think it should be them. Listen.
I believe the time is right for an international treaty or other legally binding instrument to provide the framework for a more coherent and coordinated response to future epidemics and pandemics. Whatever new structures or mechanisms are established, they must promote equity and galvanize the engagement and ownership of all countries.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of kind of toing and froing on the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty. Boris Johnson, actually, he was a signature to the article in the first place back in 2021 that kind of brought us into these conversations. They're voting on one of the final versions in May. There's been quite a lot of pushback to this, Daniel Moylan, and I think you put your name alongside that.
Well, Nigel Farage, as your colleague, has started a sort of campaign to reform the WHO, and I've signed up to that because I think it's in desperate need of reform, and I don't think they can be heard credibly on pandemic issues until they've actually dug into what the origins of the last pandemic was, because that, I think, is crucial. You can't understand how to handle a future pandemic if you don't know what started the last one. But I think the big important thing here is, and I'm fortunate I was one of a number of peers and MPs who had a meeting with the relevant minister recently to talk about it. The important things to remember before we get too panicked is that, first of all, we haven't actually seen the text of what this treaty says. Secondly, the minister assures us that a lot of the worst things in it have been taken out, and we'll be able to check that when we do see the text. And thirdly, he says that there won't be anything in it that will tie the government's hands in handling things in the best interest of the British people in the future. My only worry about that is that we often sign up to these things, I mean, like the Refugee Convention in the 1950s, and then discover that years later they're being applied in a very different way, and the courts are saying they should be interpreted. The Belfast Agreement and the European Court of Human Rights, or Convention on Human Rights, which we discussed earlier. So my worry is that there might be things in it that look fine now, but later might be interpreted some other way. But let's see the text before we get too excited about it.
Joe Phillips?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not happening right now. And this Action on World Health are the organisers of this campaign, which Nigel Farage and Daniel have got behind to reform. I mean, I think the trouble is with all these huge bodies like World Health Organisation and the UN to a certain extent and anything like that, they've become, you know, these great big juggernauts that move very slowly, that they're, you know, tied up in bureaucracy. I do think it's important that there is a global organisation that acts as a sort of a monitoring and reporting system, because otherwise, you know, how would we know what's happening, you know, whether it's Ebola, whether it's avian flu, whether it's something...
Yeah, so you can have a standardised data set to catch that information.
And all of that sort of stuff. But I can't imagine that, you know, anybody of the 149 member countries are going to say, oh, yeah, that's fine, you just decide. I mean, I think Daniel's right, let's see the text, but let's see what, you know, what it says and what it proposes. I mean, I can't see any government signing up to it, can you?
Is that your way of saying you agree with Nigel Farage?
No, not particularly. But
I thought that's the territory we were going down there, Joe.
No, I mean, I do, you know, broadly speaking, I think Nigel is probably using this as a bit of a publicity stunt, but I agree with Daniel, more importantly, that let's see the text before we start debating it in the House.
Well, many people, of course, will be familiar with Donald Trump. Do you remember his attitude to the WHO? He was having absolutely none of it at all, was he? Get out was his approach until Biden, of course, then came along and undid that.